You're broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round, and you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Move mountains, we gon' walk it out and move mountains. And I'll rise like the day. I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up, I like the waves. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's joined us for our annual 2020 Epione event. I'm Alex O'Donnell.
I'm Dawn Harris.
And together we are
Epione.
We are so excited to have so many people from all over the world join us today to hear Dr. AMC's keynote and first ever UK appearance. We can't wait to tell you more about today's incredible speaker. I'm so pleased to say that we have people from all over the world, including Canada, America, Angola, Kenya, Finland, Australia, England, Wales, Ireland, and let's not forget Bonnie, Scotland. We are so pleased to be hosting this conference in an international capacity.
Which leads us to talk about how we came to know our amazing speaker for today, Dr. AMC. Our initial connection, like for so many things, was serendipitous and began as I was searching around looking for theories about labelling. It's initiated by a doctorate I was undertaking at the time around trauma and system change, incidentally. When Alex and I read Dr. AMC's book, we were absolutely struck by her compassion and her intense intellect that just came pouring out the pages as we read her words. And we just realized here is a kindred spirit. We loved her phrases, as I'm sure you're going to hear more of them today in her talk. Her widening of the traumatic lens to include the isms in our society that we face, her commitment to change and her vigor, her energy and her practical application of theory. In combination, it makes an incredibly powerful energy for change. And the more we talked, the more excited we became and decided we had to contact Dr. AMC to see if she would do a keynote speech for us. She was very quick to respond, and we had a very positive first meeting with her, during which time it was clear that we were all thinking the same way. And Alex and I came off that Zoom call absolutely so positive and so enthused and so excited and smiling a lot because we had met Dr. AMC and the fact she'd agreed to deliver the keynote for today, which is our year's anniversary of having our conference last year in Glasgow. So at Epione, we believe in the need to act when you find those relationships within which you feel comfortable and safe to create and start change. The change can be small, but it can always grow. And it may be big to start, but it doesn't matter, because while we know that change is unfamiliar and it can be difficult for so many people, it's so much easier when you do that journey with somebody else. So we feel this in our relationship with Dr. AMC, and we are genuinely honoured and excited to have her speak today. A professional that we feel is going to make big changes within the field of trauma globally, as she has so much compassion and energy and vision, understanding, and more importantly, a connection to other people.
Okay, so we'll now just give you a snippet to let you understand Dr. AMC's bio, and then we're so excited to be able to go over live to Dr. AMC. Dr. Alisha Moreland-Capuia graduated from Stanford University and gained an MD from George Washington University. After medical school, Dr. AMC completed 4 years of training in psychiatry and fellowship in addiction medicine, both at Oregon Health and Science University. She's an expert in trauma-informed systems change and specifically interacted with numerous and varied groups of the criminal justice system. She served on the Portland Community Oversight Advisory Board, charged with monitoring and implementing of the City of Portland's settlement agreement with the US Department of Justice to enact reform to Portland Police Bureau policies and training. She's partnered with the Federal Judicial Centre and the National Judicial College to provide training for federal judges and probation officers and state Supreme Court judges, respectively. Dr. AMC has trained US senators and staffers in applying a trauma-informed lens to policies and legislation. She's training various US probation and pre-trial service district officers to facilitate trauma-informed change in the US pre-sentencing and sentencing guidelines and post-prison supervision. While in residency training, Dr. AMC built Healing Hut People of Portland, a trauma-informed, hospital-based, community-focused youth violence prevention program. Dr. AMC's trauma-informed efforts are global, as she works in Angola, Africa, at the Family Centre, and is the co-founder of the Capuia Foundation. She is currently establishing an Institute for Trauma-Informed Systems Change at the McLean Hospital Harvard Medical School and is the sole author of Training for Change, Transforming Systems to be Trauma-Informed, Culturally Responsive, and Neuroscientifically Focused. She has also contributed to local and national news. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with her husband and her children. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it gives me the greatest pleasure on behalf of Dawn and I to hand you over to Dr. AMC for this year's annual Epione 2020 Keynote.
Thank you so very much. We'll all clap collectively, not for me, but for Don and for Alex and for Epione and for all of you joining us today, all 233 individuals. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to the Minister of Health. Thank you to each of you for your collective vision. And as I think I said on an introductory video that each of you may or may not have seen, I hold a core belief that a trauma-informed world is a better world. And I am encouraged and my heart is happy, my soul is happy today because I see that I have a number of co-laborers in that effort to help the world become more trauma-informed. So thank you so very much. There are a few things I want to do. If you didn't get your coffee, I'm going to be the caffeine for today. So what I'd like to instruct you, I can see that everyone is super, super awesome with the chat box. Great, because we're going to use it. I'm also looking at each of your faces. Lisa Archibald, Amy Kirkpatrick, Sabrina, Sarah, Lilia's iPad, Christine McCauley. I'm not going to go through each of the names, but I want to demonstrate to you that through the course of our conversation today, and it is indeed a conversation, I'm going to be looking at you. I'm with you. I want to talk to you directly, and I'm going to be asking you to participate with me. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I am going to be posing a few questions throughout the course of this conversation. I'm going to ask that you kindly, to the extent that you feel safe, feel free to respond on the chat box because I'm going to be checking it. Now, I'm going to be somewhat like Oprah today. I do not have a Gail, so I'm going to have to be Oprah and Gail. Okay, so I will be doing both with regards. So as you get ready, I'm going to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint slide. And we will begin. It's all the clicking of the boxes, and I feel like I should sing for you as we, but I won't do that to you today, even though I have a pretty decent voice. I will, we'll stick to the script today. Here we are. Okay, and Alex and Don, if you would be so kind as to give me a thumbs up that you can see the screen. Amazing. Lisa, can you give me a thumbs up that you can see the screen? Awesome. See, I told you I'm going to be talking to you all today. I can see you. We're together, even if we're not. Okay. So I am absolutely thrilled to talk to you today. We're only scratching the surface, and we're going to try to cover a number of things, but I hope that this is the beginning of our conversation and not the end. I want to just, for all intents and purposes, to let you know that this is meant to be safe space. I hope that folks come exactly as they are. You can bring everything to this conversation. You can bring anxiety, you can bring frustration. All of it is welcome, to the extent that we use it to move us forward. Again, welcome. I'm super excited that you're here to join me, and let's get started. So as we talk about trauma-informed systems change, I know that much of the language and much of this are things that many of you are used to, but I want to establish sort of a shared understanding up front and a shared language that I'd like to use throughout, with your agreement, of course. Because we're trauma-informed, we ask permission for things. So here's what we'd like to accomplish today. I'm going to talk very briefly on the neurobiology of fear and trauma, because I believe it's important to connect those two things. And then we're going to talk a little bit about racism as a form of trauma, a form, and to recognize trauma in systems, and then to start the discussion about how to apply a trauma-informed lens within systems. Here's where I want to start today. Everyone has talked about this. Don and Alex and all of you I know that the key thing is safety. And here is what I would like to submit: that no matter who we are or where we come from, we are all concerned as human beings. As human beings, we are all concerned with these three things, consciously or subconsciously. And that is feeling safe, being safe, and seeking safety. Even if you're aware of it or not, these are the things that we are concerned about, that our existence as human beings center around safety. And I would add that not only are we subconsciously and unconsciously and even consciously thinking about safety and where we are in relationship to it, I hold the conviction that each of us as human beings has a right to be safe. So with that shared understanding, I want you to tack that up, because we're going to come back to this theme. We're going to move to the next portion of this talk, which is the antithesis of safety is fear. The absolute antithesis is fear. So here's where I'm going to ask you to use your chat box for the first time today. I'm going to pose this question: is there anyone among me on this call who has never been afraid? Somebody asked me to sing. I don't think you want that. Is there anyone? I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Anyone among me today who's never been afraid? Okay, Lisa, Sabrina, Claire, everybody says no. Nope. I love that. Okay, so clearly we are all on one accord. So here's what I'd like to say, because each of you has demonstrated already what I've already known to be true. I've talked to thousands of people, and no one has ever said to me, Dr. AMC, I've never been afraid. So here's what I'm going to point out and highlight: that each of us, what makes us human and what draws us together, what I call a point of convergence, is the fact that we have all been afraid. We know what that feels like. So because we know what that feels like, I want to describe it. This, my friends, is our brains on fear. Because each of us has experienced it, I want to tell you what it actually looks like. Many of you know that fear is a full court press. It involves every part of the body. But here's what happens: whether the threat is perceived or real, right? It's all about seeking safety. We are seeking safety because that's the appropriate thing to do in the face of threat. We've all experienced this. This is our brain. So I'm going to explain to you real quick as we sort of gather, we're going to set the frame, and we'll put the picture in towards the end. So because each of you have been afraid and our brains have looked like this, what tends to happen is something is happening out there that makes us feel afraid, whatever that is for you. There is the thalamus, which is this midbrain structure here, right there. This midbrain structure is really the sensory aspect. It senses it. It's sort of like a huge switchboard, and it says, oh my goodness, something out there is causing me to be anxious, afraid, or stressed. I must seek safety. So this is the sensory aspect of fear. all normal. I'm not even talking about anything that's gone awry. I'm saying this is something we've all experienced. So the thalamus, the sensory aspect of fear. And then you've got the frontal and the temporal lobes, which is the higher order sort of brain here, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about, oops, we're going ahead, a little bit more about that. You know, that sense of doom that you have, that sense of understanding that something, that cognitive awareness that something is happening that has breached your ability or compromised your ability to feel safe. That is the frontal and temporal lobes, what we call the cognitive aspect of fear. And then there is the hippocampus and the amygdala. These are the most beautiful structures ever. I get excited about the brain. You all may not, but hopefully I can get you to get excited with me. But this is also a midbrain structure. Here's the hippocampus, and I'm trying to highlight it for you. It sort of looks like a seahorse a little bit. That's how I identify. You see, it's kind of, doesn't it? If we use our imaginations, it looks like a seahorse. The hippocampus is responsible for things like declarative memory. Well, what is that, Dr. AMC? Declarative memory is things like remembering facts, consolidation of memory. Turns out it plays a very important role in the fear response. And it's interesting because when things happen to us, at the beginning, in some aspect, and this is a whole nother talk, but I'm giving you a little extra today because I loved all the smiling faces I saw, so you get extra. Typically what happens when folks or something happens that causes trauma or that causes folks to feel afraid, it is protective initially to not remember. Right? And there's some form of sort of dissociation. It is protective because you need to be able to seek safety. So remembering does not feel like it's useful, right? And you need that time to sort of process. But then in the long term, it actually is helpful to remember so that you can avoid whatever caused you to be afraid or what posed a threat in the beginning. It's a very interesting process. And when we think about how trauma is managed and processed over time, the hippocampus plays a very important role in terms of memory and how we are able to avoid and to pursue safety even further in the future. So the hippocampus, that important role. And then adjacent to the hippocampus is the amygdala. And the amygdala is this almond-like structure, and it's responsible for fear, sex drives, really, but that's where fear lives. And so essentially the hippocampus and the amygdala are responsible for the emotional memory aspect of fear. We tend to, when things have hurt us, we tend to remember them more robustly when it's attached to an emotion, right? And there's a reason. It creates salience, the amygdala, right? It helps us to understand. So then we've got the hypothalamus, and you're probably like, this is a lot. Well, I just want to show you how involved this fear process is that each of us has experienced. And it's the antithesis of safety. The hypothalamus is what most folks are more sort of familiar with, right? It is the fight, flight, or freeze response. Well, this hypothalamus turns out that it's connected to a few other things, the pituitary gland in particular, and the adrenal gland. And for extra credit points, you know, you don't have to have the right answer, but I'll give you extra credit and a gold star. Where does the adrenal gland live? You got 10 seconds. We got a lot to cover. Okay, no takers, and you cannot Google it. Okay, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm going to tell you, oh, somebody said the diagram looks like the beginning of a panic attack. I see you. Okay. So the adrenal gland, see, I'm looking at all the comments tracking. The adrenal gland lives on top of the kidney. And the adrenal gland, after the hypothalamus acts on the pituitary gland through a series of hormones, then acts on the adrenal gland, it releases over 30 plus neurohormones related to stress, cortisol being one of them. And so you can imagine this is all of our brains. We have all said together, what binds us today together is that as human beings, our natural human proclivity is to seek safety, is to be safe and to feel safe. And our bodies were designed evolutionarily to pursue safety appropriately. Does that make sense? And so the hypothalamus would be considered the physiologic aspect of fear. So now that we've got this, I'm going to do a quick summary. The thalamus is the sensory aspect of fear. The frontal and temporal lobes is the cognitive aspect. And you can kind of, I wrote it down for you too, so you can see it, but I'm going to repeat it. And the hippocampus and the amygdala is the emotional memory aspect of fear, and the hypothalamus is the physiologic aspect. Okay, now that we've got that, let's move on to even simpler, which I think becomes more practical. Now, I started the conversation out saying it's going to be important to make the connection between fear and trauma, and that as human beings, our goal is to be safe, to feel safe, or we're seeking safety. So to that end, we'll move to the next step here. So this is my sort of storyboard that tells the complete and absolute story of the connection between fear and trauma. And this is what I would submit to you, because you've already admitted it, that every single human being has experienced fear and or has been afraid. That's established. That fear is a full body response, and it stems from our natural proclivity towards survival as human beings. Now, here's an interesting fun fact. The way that the brain develops, it develops from the bottom up and the inside out. And the reason that that is incredibly important is because the bottom part of the brain is responsible for survival mechanisms like our heart beating, our ability to breathe. The middle part of the brain, we're going to call that our emotional mind. It's where the amygdala lives, right? It is where it's how we respond to things and how we sort of engage with the world is based on that middle part of the brain. The top part of our brain, also known as the cortex, is wise mind. It is our ability to regulate that emotional mind. It is our ability to regulate and to quell and to temper even our survival states. And it turns out that the external environment plays an incredible role in that. But here is an even more important point. When each of us are born, if we are understanding that the brain develops from the bottom up to the inside out, when each of us are born, the most developed part of our brain is not the top cortex control, exercise good judgment, regulatory component. The most developed part of our brain when each you and I and every single other human being in this world was born is the bottom part of our brain. It's the survival part. So I've just spent the last 10 minutes working to convince you that we're all concerned about survival, whether we're conscious of it or not. And we have proof, very specific neurobiological, brain developmental proof that is what we are all born with. It starts with survival. And then the question becomes how much of our lives is centered on survival versus being able to thrive. It's a fine point if you catch it. We'll come back to it. So this idea that fear is a full body response, it stems from our human proclivity towards survival. And then I've gone through with you the multiple aspects of our brain on fear. But here's another important point. The fear response, it is designed by nature to be time and threat limited. So what do you mean by that? Essentially, once the threat, perceived or real, is gone, I'm going to do air quotes here and lean in. Our fear response should theoretically be quelled or come down to some baseline. But here's my question to each of you. What do you suppose happens when the fear response, which is appropriately designed to help us appropriately seek safety, what do you suppose happens when that fear response, which is meant to be time and threat limited, what happens when that fear response doesn't turn off? Just a few guesses, and I'll take I'll take 10 seconds on the chat box. What would you suppose happens? I kind of give you the answer, but there are probably other thoughts. The Cliff Note version. Yep, stress, habituation. Yep, okay, Earl J, I see we've got some scientists among us. Okay, I see you. Dysregulation, frozen illness. All of those are correct. At toxic stress. Yes, Shamala, I hope I pronounced that name right. Fear persists. Yes. Substance misuse. Okay, somebody's going even deeper. I love it. And I hope that you are also seeing each other's, all the collective intelligence and brilliance we have here. We've got a lot of intellectual capital because you are all absolutely correct. What happens when the fear response does not turn off are lots of things. It is a stress response. It is cortisol levels that are not meant to be high. And as many of you have identified, when stress is high, the internal milieu changes effectively. Inflammatory factors in the body are present. You are more prone to chronic illnesses because you're not meant to be stressed all the time. There's a functional role of stress, and then there is, as someone indicated on here already, toxic stress, which we will talk about. But essentially, here is where we get to the shared understanding and what I want to help folks realize. Each of you knows personally what it feels like to be in a state of trauma and fear. And I just want to pause for one moment. And you all, this is my humanity. My daughter's heading off to school. Today is her birthday. I just want to tell her, happy birthday. I love you and I'll see you after school. Mwah, mwah, mwah. Okay, back to our scheduled programming. Okay, so essentially what happens in this particular instance is the fear response, which each of us has, that helps us to appropriately seek safety when it does not turn off, when it is on all of the time, essentially 24/7, 365 days a year. You all know what that feels like. You know that when you're afraid, you're not thinking straight. You know that when you've been afraid, you're not doing calculus. You know that when you're afraid, motoric skills or your ability to be sort of concentrated and focused, it's compromised. We know, just as human beings, what it feels like to be in that state. And because you know, that already puts you ahead of the curve in terms of your ability to empathize with this next step that I'm going to talk about. So fear, and this is an important point, fear that does not turn off is one way to understand the neurobiological definition of trauma. It is a fear response that doesn't quite shut off. And here is what our friend, and I know that all of you are familiar with van der Kolk, says, and it's really a summation of what I've just shared with you, is that traumatization occurs when both our internal and external resources are inadequate to cope with external threat. And I want us to really take that in because I'm going to use a bunch of if-then clauses. If you get this and you appreciate this point, then you'll be able to understand the next points moving forward. You all are already experts because we've all experienced fear. And so to imagine, it wouldn't be a stretch to imagine what that fear response would look like on all the time. I give the example, and I'll give this quickly. I always give the example of the fact that I used to watch scary movies quite a bit. Don't judge me, but you can if you want. It's okay. I can, you know, I can accept that judgment. I used to watch the scary movies. You would have a said character running from a said threat. And the said character would always have the keys in their hands, running to get it, you know, the keys in the lock to the, you know, the keys in the hand, trying to get the keys in the lock. What happens to the keys in the movie when the character is trying to get the keys in the lock and they're running from the threat? What happens? Just write it out for me. What happens to those keys? Chat box chatter right now. What happens to those darn keys? Yes, they don't work. Drop. Shaking. Keys drop. Yes, Donna, they drop. Yes, Chris. Yes, SWC Susan McKellar. You say I said that full name. Look at that. You're absolutely correct. They get to the door and we're yelling at the screen. My goodness, get those keys in the lock. But here's what I have come to understand in my 15 years of studying fear and how it works and impacts us as human beings. It turns out that when you're that afraid, the part of the brain that is responsible for allowing us to have that level of motoric sophistication that is required to get the key in the lock, that part of the brain is not working when we're afraid. That's the top part of the brain. The part of the brain that is operating when we're afraid is the bottom. We're in survival. And that survival means I've got to seek safety. And that can sometimes come at the expense of being able to be in the top part of your brain, right? So it is a privilege for some of us to be living in the prefrontal cortex, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So again, trauma can be understood neurobiologically as a fear response that doesn't quite turn off. Okay, I think we're cooking with fine olive oil, so we're gonna move to the next point here. We cannot talk about trauma and fear without, and I'm going to agree because I heard some of this. Don and Alex are so thoughtful that we were having a conversation. They said, well, you know, their ACEs doesn't tell the whole story. And I'm going to say, I agree. It doesn't tell the whole story. It is a part of it, of an ever evolving larger story. And that is this. I'm going to give it to you. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, I want to talk about the original study in 1998, not the spinoffs. We'll get to that later, but I think that there's something to be said about the original study. The original study by Felida and Anda, as many of you probably know, was originally an obesity study. You all knew that, right? That it was originally an obesity study that was being done down at Kaiser. And what happened was, in this particular group, you would see there was actually a pretty significant number of individuals who would lose a certain amount of weight, and then they drop out of the program. And it became such a huge phenomenon that it couldn't be ignored. So they decided that they, in post hoc analysis, they were going to study this. Okay, let me tell you about the demographics. Demographics were this: over 17,000 individuals, over 17,000 of those individuals, they were insured, they were employed, they were educated, and they were overwhelmingly white. Now that's important. And they lived in San Diego, which is great, right? Because it's sunny all the time. Now, the reason I say this is because in this original study, when you look at all of the questions that were asked originally, and these were tough questions. I mean, questions that I think, for anyone under 18 could be sort of triggering. They're asking about, divorce. They're asking about individuals in the family who may have had struggled with substances of abuse, or had even been incarcerated. There were a number of specific things that were being asked in the original Adverse Childhood Experiences survey. Of course, all of the forms of abuse, psychological, emotional, sexual, all of those things were originally asked. Now, the reason I told you about their original demographics is because this is a group, when we think about protective factors and resilience, they're educated. They have, they college educated, they have insurance, good jobs. And still, even within this particular demographic, over 80% reported one or more adverse childhood experiences, right? And what that suggested to me and to all of us who study this is that trauma does not care who you are. Everyone is impacted by it in some way. And what the study concluded, as many of you know, is that the higher the adverse childhood experience score, the higher the risk are for chronic medical conditions and also chronic behavioral conditions. Interestingly enough, I think it's important to point out, we did not have time today because we only had less than about an hour, but it is important to note that Phillida and Anda were smart enough, and I've met Anda and presented with him once at a conference, and he's awesome, is that it starts at the point of conception. And the reason that is important is because that's actually where brain development starts. And so that's a very large public health, that it has public health implications. If you want to know more about it, save that question for the Q&A. But here's the deal. These adverse childhood experiences at the base certainly impact the way that the brain and other parts of the nervous system develop. That changes the risk of social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, health risk behaviors. Of course, the changes in health risk behaviors impacts disease states and can potentially contribute to early death. That's without intervention. But here's the more, I think, critical piece. Before there was ever, and all of these guys, they love pyramids and triangles, and we're going to see a few more pyramids and triangles. But here's what I say that undergirds this work. And it's interesting, if you look at the original survey, what undergirds Phillida and Anda's work is really Maslow. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and many can argue that there's not a cultural frame in that. I would agree. However, we have to respect it because I think that it still has very useful implications. And that is, Maslow says that for each of us, for you and me, that we are more likely to brush up against the edges or the acme of self-actualization, which is the acme of his triangle, if we have some basic needs met. It turns out that access to food and water is important. It turns out that the ability to be safe, both physically and financially, is incredibly important. It turns out that love and belonging is incredibly important. Now, Maslow said this to us in the 1940s, right? That these are very important things in esteem building. And that if we have these basic, this is not extraordinary outside of the ordinary. These are the basic things that Maslow essentially pointed out and said that each of us as human beings require in order to move close to or brush up against and achieve and attain self-fulfillment or self-actualization. So here is why this is important, because underneath all of it, when we think about trauma, when we think about violence, even from a frame, you cannot think of trauma without considering what undergirds that, which oftentimes is unmet need. So the question for me is, where is the need? And that's an even larger discussion. So then I want to round this first part of the discussion out with this. I've indicated to you, and you've indicated to me, that we've all been afraid. And now we know that there are multiple aspects and cascading effects of being stressed, of being traumatized, or being afraid. This stress response is very powerful. And I wanted to show it, demonstrate it, because it is the thing that we keep coming back to and understanding physiologically. While you can't see it, people feel it, and it is silently, in many ways, killing folks, right? So you have the stress response, as I indicated, whether that is, again, this being in this chronic state of seeking safety, and the hypothalamus is involved, and the pituitary gland is involved, and through the hormone, of adrenocorticotropin hormone, it acts on the adrenal gland, which is on top of the kidney, and you get the release of cortisol. And what normally should happen is that when our stress is gone, is that there is the body is beautiful, that it's regulated, that, right, it's gone, cortisol levels sort of, they temper out, and we get back to sort of baseline, right? But in a stress response gone awry, this is the process that likely results in an increase in chronic conditions, because we know that cortisol, what comes with it is inflammatory factors and inflammation in the body, and certainly other risk and changes in the brain and in the nervous system peripherally. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. Okay, here's our opportunity to do a quick exercise together to gel up some of our understanding. Okay, now it says buddy up. I know you can't buddy up, but you're gonna buddy up with yourselves, okay? Because we like ourselves, so we're gonna buddy up with ourselves. Only Alex and Don are able to potentially do this. I'm only gonna give you 15 seconds, okay? 15 seconds to do this. I'm gonna have, and you don't look at your names so I want you to be as honest as possible. Don't look at your names. If you can and feel comfortable, type your first and last name backwards in the chat box, and I'm gonna give you 10 seconds. I'm gonna start the count now. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You're done. It's over. Nope, you can't. Okay, so I see. Okay, Louise. Great. Okay, now we're going to stop there. You're probably like, here's my second question. Okay, good job for all of those who did that. Thank you so much. You're a talent. You're a gift. Now, here's the question. Why in the world would I ask you to do such a thing? Any guesses? Okay. All right. I see stress. It made us panic. Okay. Test cognitive function. If I really wanted to test cognitive function, I would have asked you I would do the clock draw with you, but that's also another talk. But yes. Okay. Because I put you under stress conditions, and then I'm counting like, and then I move faster, and then I raise my voice a little, so you're kind of under these stress conditions, and some folks did well, and some folks may have struggled. Now, I can tell you that when we do this exercise in person, we actually usually take about 30 to 45 minutes because of the next question that I'm going to ask. What assumptions did I make by asking you to do this exercise? Just briefly, what assumptions did I make? Memory and stress, i.e. the keys. Yep. Literacy. Yes, Earl. We could do it, Sabrina. Yep. That we could spell. Cameron. Yep. That I could write. Lucy, Karen. Yep. That we could do it fast. Yep. Sylvia, that we were all literate. All good points. Okay. So you all are good. We can look at the chat box as I am too. And then let me just go ahead and give you the answer real quick for the sake of time. You're all absolutely right. You're on point. I put you under stress conditions. I asked you to do this, and then I made a ton of assumptions. I assumed that, first of all, English is a first language. I assumed that we all learn the same. I assumed that we were not stressed. I assumed that everybody was well rested, again, that attention and that there's reading and comprehension. I made a lot of assumptions. And I can tell you that when I've done this exercise over the last 3 years, that I've collected a list There's over 1,000 different things that folks come up with about what I assumed about you, that you're learned, that right, and you put some of them in the chat box that you could spell. And here's the point of why I did this, the overarching point. It is to demonstrate that there are specific things that systems assume about the individuals that they serve. And here is one thing. I assumed, here's the key point. I assumed that each of you were able to work here at the top part of the brain, to override the bottom, to work at the top. I had a top brain mandate. And then I created bottom brain conditions because I on purpose wanted you to be stressed, right? But this is what the system sometimes unintentionally does. Systems is that the system will have a top brain mandate, and it's trying to serve individuals who are bottom brain surviving, functioning. And what it means to be trauma informed is consider this the gap and the space between those two things. So I always ask the question, what is the system assuming? And is it helpful? And this is just one way to demonstrate, because I made a lot of assumptions and I wish we had more time to go through all of those, but I got to keep moving because I don't want Don and Alex to, I've got to respect the time that they have given me. And I want to respect your time as well. Okay, so as we think about this work, we're going to make a little bit of a shift, and partly because as we talk about trauma, there are so many forms of trauma. I feel like the time that we're living in right now, the geopolitical environment, it's been very tough. And so I just want to offer a particular lens, one exercise to kind of think about how systems can start the process of thinking about multiple forms of trauma. Okay, so it's not just that this is the only form, but here's what I would submit to you. If you all could understand this idea and concept of fear, because we've experienced it, what that feels like, how uncomfortable it is, how it hurts, how it compromises our ability to be able to function in the moment, that it is meant to be time limited, that we are all concerned and we all have the right to be safe, that there are some among us who, us included, right? Each of us have experienced this where you don't feel safe for various reasons. Racism is one of those. Racism is one form of trauma in systems. And I would say that anything that is trauma informed must consider this particular factor, that a trauma informed approaches should be considered universal operating procedures and standards. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that feels like. So I wanted to talk with you about a particular study, several studies that have been done, because it's one thing to kind of talk about sort of a personal experience. This is another thing to think about the literature and what research actually demonstrates. There are several comprehensive meta-analysis on racism as a powerful social construct and how it has impacted overall health of people of color, namely Black individuals. There's Paradis et al., there's Cormack et al., and then Quaddy et al. And they all demonstrate that racism has had a deleterious impact. And I want to go through a particular definition by Harrell in this 2000 study, because it is a complete definition, and it is, I think, a very helpful one for those who are in the field of healing and understanding trauma in its whole. So it is a system of dominance, power, and privilege based on racial group designations where members of the dominant group create or accept their societal privilege by maintaining structures, ideology, values, and behavior that have the intent or effect of leaving non-dominant group members relatively excluded from power or equal access to societal resources. Now, that's one working definition. And when we think about it, we have to think structurally and historically. So racism is the center, and we wanted to give sort of the definition of it. And then there are multiple systems that were built by racism, and the center can't hold without these systems reinforcing. So I'm going to pose a question, and I know this is when it gets a little bit quiet, but we are in a time, and as healers, it is one of the things, healers and folks who are on our own paths to healing, it is something that I think we cannot ignore. So when we think about this, I'll pose the question and use myself as the example. If I work within a system that was built by racism, does that make me racist? Answer it in your spirit, not on the chat box. I'm going to answer it for you. If I work within a system that was built by racism, does that make me racist? Well, the answer is absolutely not. It doesn't. The answer is no, it doesn't. But here's what it does make me. It makes me responsible to actively think about what I can do as a member of the system to thoughtfully deconstruct this very powerful social construct so that everyone around me can be and feel safe and belong and feel valued. Right? So there's a huge difference. Many of you have seen all of the things I didn't want to use any examples other than in America because not to offend, I'm like, we'll talk about America's issues and then you can extrapolate them if you need to. I'm taking I'll take all of that. I'll take it and hold it. But interestingly enough, we're in an era of COVID-19. I know a lot of folks are really hurting from the uncertainty of that. It really has impacted everyone, no matter who you are, where you sit, fortunately or unfortunately. And really when COVID hit, it caused all of us to have to be silent and still for a moment in ways that some of us were not used to. And in that silence and stillness, there were things that we saw that we couldn't unsee. And one was George Floyd, which became an international phenomenon. When folks saw the police put their knee on this man's neck and him call out for his mother, it was as though every mother could hear that cry, regardless of the color of his skin. And what it then caused folks to do, because they saw and they felt something for the first time in a long time, was to reevaluate what they could do. And so as we started to think about these systems, I started to think about the metaphorical knee that many of these systems have had on the necks of Blacks and minorities over the years. And the question becomes, what can we do from where we sit as international and national healers, as folks who are concerned with reducing human suffering? What can we do? And one way to think about what we can do is to take our trauma-informed lens into the spaces and places in which we are in. So with that being said, systems change. This is one of my key statements. Systems change when people change. And people change when they feel something. Nothing in history has ever changed in the absence of feeling. And I can tell you from this point forward that when we get into Brene Brown says that the feeling space is the birthplace for change. I agree, it is. We are more likely to be willing to consider the possibility of change when we can relate to what is being asked and when we can relate to that feeling. I am convinced that everyone who hears this talk and joins me today can meet me there because we all have been afraid. And in individuals who have experienced racism or any kind of ism understands what that is like. So we're gonna do a quick exercise, and I wanna warn you, because I think that's a trauma-informed thing to do. I'm going to be showing a few images. Those images may bring up all sorts of memories. So I want to invite you, if you feel like you want to turn off your video for the next 5 minutes, then I encourage you to do so, because it's going to be images of individuals who have done things that are hard. And so the reason that we're going to do this exercise is because it demonstrates, I think we're getting into this feeling space. You are going to feel something. And so here's all I ask if you're participating. When I show the image, here are the rules of engagement. I don't want you, if you know who the person is, don't tell me who the person is. All I want you to do is to give for me, to the extent that you feel comfortable, in the chat box, to tell me what the first thought that comes to your mind when you see the image. Just the first thought. Now catch this. I don't want the second filtered thought. Now, why doesn't Dr. AMC want the second filtered thought? Right? Lisa, you feel me because you're smiling, so you understand where I'm about to go here. I don't want the second filtered thought because what we know from studies is that it's actually our initial thoughts that subconsciously drive our behavior. And it's okay. I want to know what you're thinking. So here we go. I'm going to bring up an image. It's only going to be for 10 seconds. You're going to give me, to the extent that you feel comfortable, your initial thoughts. Okay, here we go. And I'm actually going to talk through this real quick. This one real quick. This is because it may be a little blurry. So this was in Kenosha, Wisconsin. A Black man was shot in the back 7 times in front of his children. in the car, and he lived to talk about it. He was paralyzed from the waist down, and at one point was handcuffed to his hospital bed, secondary to a warrant. This is a woman who was in Colorado, and she and her kids were on their way on a Sunday to go get their nails done, and the car was mistaken for being stolen, and the police officers dragged them out of the car, put the kids on the ground. These are 6 to 17-year-old kids with guns drawn on them, and the kids are crying to one another, "What did we do?" So I want you to think about the impact of that. And then the police waited hours to apologize once they realized that they had mistakenly identified this family. This is a lawmaker in Oregon who her name is her name is she actually just won, Janelle Bynum, representative. She works in Salem. She makes laws. She's incredible. Quick story. She was in the neighborhood, canvassing in the neighborhood that she serves. And in the neighborhood, essentially, one of the neighbors saw her. What she was doing is if someone was there, she'd talk to them. If they weren't, she'd stop and take a note. And one of the neighbors saw her stopping to take a note and essentially called the police and said that she saw a Black woman casing houses. So lucky for Representative Bynum, Officer Campbell came. And when Officer Campbell came, he asked a few questions and essentially said, "Hey, I just want you to know that someone called the police here, and I want you to know that they were concerned." And so the good representative said, "Well, let me talk to this person because maybe there's been a mistake." So they go to have the conversation, and the woman says, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know who you were." And she introduced herself and said, "Hey, I serve you in Salem." Here's the point. Representative Bynum and her husband have more degrees than a thermometer. They're educated people. They are church going. They don't have a criminal record. They have 4 children. They own 2 successful businesses. They are good people. They serve the community. And my question is, when will it be enough? When will it be enough? Okay, images. 10 seconds, thoughts. Yep, default racism, boy, bomb, fear. You guys are good. I love it. Inmate, okay. Just leave it 10 seconds. Was that too quick? Oh, I love it. I see it. I see. I'm trying to click through these chats too. See, I need my Gail. Sad, frightening, mugshot, hurt, confused. Yep, mental health, murder. Oh, yep. I appreciate the honesty. I'm loving. Okay, here we go. Let me make sure I'm moving through this too, because I tend to over participate in my own session. So, okay. Get there. Okay. I see the image. Thank you so much for the participation. I see it. I see it. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. And I thank you. I see all the comments, and each of you can see everybody's comments. Thank you so much for your participation. It means a lot to me to have you participating so thoughtfully. I showed you a series of images, and we'll go into what those were, and in terms of this exercise. This picture, it just leaps out. It is incredible, the amount of pain. It is palpable. It is guttural. It is profound. And I can tell you that while folks may not be able to identify with the other images, everybody can identify with this, because we have all at some point experienced this level of hurt. And the argument that I would make is each of us have concerned ourselves with making sure that we reduce human suffering. And I'm going to talk today only about 2 forms of suffering. There's unnecessary suffering and inevitable suffering. And as a healer, as someone who works to do good and to serve others, to the extent that I can, I want to eliminate completely unnecessary, needless suffering. And with the inevitable suffering, I know that it can't be prevented. We all will suffer at some point. It is my job to help assist folks in learning how to suffer well. So it is, how do we cope? How do we make our way through this? This is unnecessary suffering. This is preventable suffering. And because we have known such pain and we know how hard this is, we each should be concerned with reducing the unnecessary human suffering. This is Trayvon Martin's father at his burial, burying his son ahead of the life cycle. I'm going to take you through this exercise. I'm going to tell you who I showed you. I showed you Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh was responsible for the Oklahoma bombing here in the United States. Killed people. And got out alive. James Holmes was a gentleman who sort of looked like the Joker a little bit. He went into a movie theater and shot up folks and got out alive. Eric Harris and Dylan Clabeau, they were on the Time magazine. They looked like your everyday neighbor. They were responsible for Columbine. Jeremy Christian, the gentleman with the long hair in Portland, Oregon, was responsible for killing 2 people on our MAX transportation system after racist and homophobic and Islamophobic rants on a public transportation line, and then threatened to kill the police, and he got out alive. And then this one is the most hard for me. It was Dylan Roof, was in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, where 9 people prayed for him and with him, and then he killed all of them. And then the officers who arrested him still saw his humanity and took him to meet a basic need, took him to Burger King to get a meal before he was taken to the station. Okay, Trayvon Martin, I showed you a picture in Florida, was killed. You probably know the story, Skittles and iced tea. Michael Brown was a gentleman who in Ferguson, Missouri was killed by police. Freddie Gray was in Baltimore, Maryland, which is an East Coast city, was arrested and his neck was broken, was thrown in the back of a paddy wagon, and lifeless body was just, and what I said is, this gentleman, somebody loved him. That's somebody's child. That's somebody loves these people, right? All of these folks were loved by someone. Sandra Bland in Texas. We don't know if it would, people still argue whether or not it was a homicide or a suicide, but she dared to talk back to the police. Eric Garner in New York, Breonna Taylor in her own bed at home, and Ahmaud Arbery jogging in a neighborhood. Now, here's the thing. We can talk about exceptions, and there are many exceptions. However, what I'm asking each of us to do who's on this call is to appreciate the pattern. We are astute enough to appreciate the pattern. And the question that I would ask is, what does the pattern suggest? On the Timothy McVeigh side, the column, what do all of these individuals have in common? Quickly. What do they have in common? They're white. Yep. Thanks, Sandra. Yep. Okay. Quickly on the, yep. And then on the Trayvon Martin side, what do all of these individuals have in common? Right. So let me just quickly, let me quickly sum up this exercise, which again is the goal is to think about this. As we think about the patterns, which I'm asking us to appreciate, the Timothy McVeigh column, all of these individuals were white males who killed people and who got out alive, right? And that's good. We want folks to get, I believe in mercy and rehabilitation and all of that. And then on the Trayvon Martin side, you have Black men and women who were killed. They killed no one. They were killed. They're dead based on bearing the weight of other people's suspicion. What does the pattern suggest, and what can we do about it is the question. In the world, racism as a powerful social construct is subconsciously, it is consciously denied, but subconsciously applied. Ever had anybody tell you you're awesome, but not treat you like it? Harvard professor David Williams gives a TED talk on how racism is making us sick. And I would suggest that everyone take the time to look at that TED talk. And as we talk about sort of structural change and what we can do, thinking about particular elements of trauma within a system, Shine does a beautiful job of helping us think through what systems can do to consider the things that hurt people, to consider the things that keep people hurt, and to consider what we can do to make a change. Many of you know about explicit and implicit bias, but the way that Shine talks about it is through observable and not observable objects. And to move through this rather judiciously, I'll say this. There are things that we observe and we see and we make quick judgments on, and we say, oh, it must be that because we see it. We know a police officer is a police officer because they wear this. We know a doctor is a doctor because they do this. And then we sort of make our judgments based on what we see. But what Shine says, and most of the time organizations move to make changes based on what they can observe. And what Shine says, argues very eloquently, is that no, maybe what we should be considering more effectively to move more judiciously and thoughtfully towards change are the things we don't see. So we don't come to work and tell people what we believe, right? I believe, we live it out, but it's the norms and values that drives our behaviors. And then he talks about the underlying assumptions. And those underlying assumptions are things like this. If I were to say to you, all purple people are bad, what would you say to me? You would probably say, Dr. AMC, that is ridiculous. You are ridiculous. Why would you say that? But then you're on your way to the grocery store after we complete our time together and you see a purple person. What do you think? Let's be honest. If we're being honest, you're like, well, the woman with the hoop earrings did say that all purple people are bad, right? So here's the deal. I have called into question with my narrative something that was not a question prior. So my language has now shaped what you now assume, whether consciously or subconsciously. So there's something very powerful about organizations and systems thinking about narrative, underlying assumptions, and norms and values as a means of moving towards change. Because I believe what compelled your presence here today is what compelled mine. We want something to change. And to the issue of narrative, here's what we know to be true, that narrative influences thoughts. Thoughts have impacts on behavior, and behavior definitely has impacts on action. You all know about cognitive restructuring. If we can change the way we think, we are more likely to be able to change the way we act. And so there is this very powerful, simple, yet very difficult thing to do, which is to change narrative. And so what Shine concludes is that in order for any system to make changes, they've got to dig down to their deepest level of basic assumption. And I want to take you back to the exercise that we did when I assumed a lot about you, right? You got 10 seconds, right? So I'm asking, what are the assumptions? It is a very critical point. And as we think about change in general, there are a few key points that I want to make before we move to the conclusion. And you all have been so awesome, and I'll take questions, thoughts, challenges, and reservations. As we think about change, there are a few, I think, key important points. I was watching a TED Talk, and the TED Talk was on success versus mastery. And when you think about change in general, change is really not about success. And you're like, what? I'm about to blow your mind with this. Success is a one-time event. It is a one-time event. Success is like doing archery and hitting the mark the first time you do it. It's one for one. What I would argue is what this TED Talk argued is that in the change process, we're not looking for success, we're looking for mastery. And so it's not one for one, we're looking for 8 for 10. That means that mastery is the process by which we are constantly aiming for the mark, recognizing that in that process, we may indeed miss it. Right? But it is the process of perfecting our ability to become more accurate and increasing and improving the probability that over time, we are more likely to hit the mark. So it's not one for one change, it's 8 for 10, right? We're not looking for success, we're looking for mastery. And then as we also think about the change process, it's very interesting. Most folks don't want to talk about it, but it is very, very important. Power, it's such a dirty word. Nobody wants to talk about it, but everybody wants it. And everybody wants to know who has it and where it's shifting and how they can get it. You don't have to admit it to me. I already know, right? But here's the deal. Power, if I were to ask you the question, where do you see in these concentric circles? One of my good mentors did this with me back in training. Says, Dr. AMC, where, if power were in the middle, where would you see yourself in relationship to power? And I'll just use myself as an example, but it's something I think that would be a worthwhile endeavor for you as well. I said, oh, well, I'm definitely, I would put myself, about two concentric circles out. I'm close to it, but I'm not like right in it, right? And then she said, well, then if that's where you think you are, where do you think other people think you are in relationship to power? I said, well, I don't know. And this mentor said, well, you are right, according to other people, in the center of it. And I had to think about that. And then we went through this exercise of the things that render you powerful. And it turns out it isn't the things that most folks would imagine. Education, stature, language, school, those are important. But what was even more important was a sense of personal power and self-efficacy, the things that people can't take from you. Right? The things that, many folks in leading up to this, I saw the wonderful social media tweets and things that folks were saying, we know we are experts on this because we have lived through it. And that makes me powerful. Not only have we lived through it, we are living through it. We are making our way. We are reconciling. We are doing what we need to do. And it is, so I would say with that power and influence that each of you have, how can you harness that for change must be considered in every single change process. Okay, let me keep moving. Then Simon Sinek talks about the golden circle. Here's what I think is incredible. As he talks about this golden circle in his TED Talk, it is an interesting phenomenon because when we talk about the change process itself and how people come to change and are willing to change with you, he makes the argument, something that we all know intuitively, but then he actually coined it. He was actually smart enough to codify it, but we all know this intuitively, that change doesn't happen from the outside in, it happens from the inside out. So essentially he says, people don't change because of what and how, they change because of why. They change because of what you believe. People don't follow you because of what, they follow you because of why you believe, right? I believe, right? So it's you believe and you share a belief, and that draws people to move. And it turns out that the way that change happens from the inside out, in the way that people move towards change from the inside out, is the same way that the brain develops, from the bottom up and the inside out. And so it means something. Do you get that? I mean, this is so incredibly important. It's not about the rationale, it's about the emotion. Remember I said to you, systems change when people change, and people change when they feel something. It is a true statement that we change when we feel, right? So we don't run away from it, we move towards it. He just says, I believe. So I'm gonna do it here. I believe that everyone has the right to be safe, and that a trauma-informed world is a better world. Who wants to join me? Now that's much better than join me because, right? So we're on a I believe mission together to make the world more trauma-informed and to recognize that there are multiple forms of trauma. And because human beings work within systems, all systems should be concerned about trauma. Wherever there's a human being, there's the possibility of trauma, and every system has a responsibility to acknowledge that. Does that make sense? Okay, I gotta keep moving. And then as we think about the change process, we can't ignore equity. Y'all may have heard folks say all the time, a rising tide lifts all boats. I call BS. A rising tide does not lift all boats. That statement makes an assumption. And what is the assumption? The assumption is that everybody has a boat, that everybody has the same boat, that everybody knows how to use the boat. And I'm saying a more equitable statement is considering all of those pre-factors to ensure that everybody has a boat, can use it, wants to use it, has access to one. Those are the upstream questions that have to be answered, the preconditions to make this a true statement. I want to ensure that when the tide rises, that everyone can seize the opportunity of the tide rising. And we're more likely to do that if we make sure that everyone has access and knows how to use the boat. Change processes always consider upstream factors. Okay. And this is one of my favorites, one of my absolute favorites, that when we think about the law of diffusion of innovation, I blocked it out and looked at change. I'm making the same point here. It's the same point that Sinek made. It is, you're going to get your early adopters, folks who are like, oh, I want to do it just because I like change, right? There's some people who wake up in the morning ready to change. Can you come work for me if that's you, or with me? But then there are those who are like, okay, we're going to adopt it because we believe that there could be something awesome. So you get that first sort of 16% just at base that are just ready to join you. But the change, the true change happens at the tipping point. And that is beyond the 16%. What we want is the early majority and the late majority. And we're more likely to move in that direction of helping people change with us or supporting or facilitating change when people believe, when they believe in the same things that you believe, when they can relate to what they're being asked to do. Now, I want to take us back to the very beginning. I asked all of you, is there anybody among me who's never been afraid? All of you, none of you said no. So we've all been afraid, right? And because we understand that process, we understand it very real to us, we are more likely to be willing to make an adjustment as a consequence. Okay. So now there are a few things I want to make sure we discuss in relationship to today. It's a lot of things we covered, but in terms of helping systems move towards a trauma-informed approach, it involves the following. It involves appreciating the connection between fear and trauma, identifying it within a system. It involves prioritizing safety. What does it look like to create a system where everyone feels like they belong for its members? And this is important. The system has to do it for its members and those the system seeks to serve. It's about safety for all involved. Consider the power of narrative and how it shapes culture. To check underlying assumptions, to acknowledge and address unmet need within a system, and the importance of placing humanity at the center of what we do. And then I would never tell anybody what to do because nobody wants to be told what to do, but I do have a have you considered moment. And in that have you considered moment, these are some of the things that I ask. All systems, has the organization or system identified the fear and trauma within the system? What assumptions are made by and within the system? Does the narrative that shapes policies and practices, are they trauma informed? Is the need for safety prioritized? And this is an important one. You can put any ism in here, but we talked today about racism specifically, but are we reconciling the system that was shaped by racism? If not, why? Because it's a form of trauma. And if our goal is to not perpetuate it, we have to be concerned about it. And then in terms of operationalizing, we talked about a few of these, but I want to go through a few briefly. It is important to create the conditions for safety by making certain that physical suffering and or concerns are recognized and managed. And there, if you want to know more about how to do that, it's in the book. Okay, and then to acknowledge and address the underpinnings of racism in the system, to suspend judgment. The good minister today talked about, not the minister in the church, but the minister of mental health, talked about listening. And it is important, my grandmother used to say all the time that listening is a form of love. And we are certainly in a time where we are all in need of a little bit more love, and listening is, you want to love more, listen more. Definitely, it is a part of the trauma-informed frame. And then this idea of changing the way we pose questions to reduce questions that infer guilt, blame, or shame. And I'm gonna give an example. I've got kids, one of them just went off to school today and turned 10, yay. They're getting grown. It's like, I did it, they're all alive, and well. But there was a time when the kids are so young and they'd be playing together, and there'd be times where you hear something break and you run up the stairs and someone's crying and you run up the stairs. What's the first question you ask if you heard something break and kids are crying? Be honest, chat box, real quick. What do you say when you hear the kids upstairs crying? Who did that? Yes, Shamel, you get the gold star today because you're telling the truth. What's wrong? Right. Okay. So the honest response is you're up there and you're like, who did it? Right. And what response do you get? What you get is, I don't know, the boogeyman. You get lies, and you get lies because it is what every human being does to try to protect themselves in the moment. It is a natural response. Is it appropriate? Right? But here's the deal. Because of the work that I've been able to do and my understanding over time, my kids have gotten the benefit. And that is, instead of going into the room and asking the kids who did it or any of that, my first question to my children is everybody safe? And then once we've established safety, guess what? We get closer to the truth, because now it's not about blame or shame or guilt, or it is, oh, we've established safety first. We've established safety first. So now it is, oh, I was playing and Superman and then I broke and then, and now we get to the truth. And I give that example because adults need that level of intervention too. To pay attention to how we ask questions, to pay attention to when we are asking questions. The goal should always be to establish safety so that we get to the truth and closer to our ability to facilitate healing. Powerful point. That is the heart of being trauma informed. And then there is the opportunity to remove the element of surprise and uncertainty, and to educate as you go along. I am a physician, I am a servant, I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, I'm a granddaughter, we're all multiple things. When I go into a room to see a patient, I want them to know exactly what I'm gonna do before I do it and to gain permission. You are the expert on you. That's respected, honored in this moment. Between our shared expertise, we should come together with some working frame that works for you, right? So is it okay if I? Might it be all right if I? And when you are able to communicate in such a way that reduces anxiety, and create safety. Again, I told you, we're all concerned about safety. It centers around safety and how we create it for ourselves and for each other. Then we get to the healing part. If we do these things, and I've only given you some steps, again, I'm going to plug the book. It's in the book. The rest is in the book. But if you do these things, we are more likely to reduce greater traumatization within systems and within ourselves, to facilitate healing, to promote bidirectional engagement that leads to the outcomes that the system desires, right? If the system is desiring to help people get well, the approach has to be different. This you're going to get as a gift from Don and Alex after, but it is a one-pager that allows you that I want to facilitate the process of you kind of being able to digest and think about some of the things that we've talked about today. This is one way. I like to think in boxes, X and Y axes. And so one of these we didn't really get to completely, and that's the brain development piece, but you can think about some of that. But the trauma-informed lens and the culturally responsive lens, there are a few questions to jumpstart your thinking, but I'd like you to add questions to the boxes. So from a policy perspective, like you match them up. Where have we placed trauma? Do our policies account for trauma? Do our policies avoid further perpetuation of trauma, right? Let's look at practices from a culturally responsive. Our practices culturally responsive, and what does that mean for you? So there's an opportunity for you to take this sheet. You can add more questions to it. I just jump-started some of it for you, but to think about, this is how you start to think about how you began to employ some of the things that we have shared today. And this is my absolute last slide. Trauma-informed systems change is intimately attached to two things, and that is creating safety for and meeting basic needs of members in the system, and creating safety for and meeting basic needs of those the system seeks to serve. It's a parallel process. So in other words, I am more likely to facilitate healing and change if I'm working on my own healing and change. I just want to offer my most profound thanks to each of you for what you've done, what you are doing, and what you will do, and to know that you've got a friend and a partner in me in your efforts to create trauma-informed or facilitate trauma-informed change. Again, thank you, Epione. Thank you, UK. Thank you, Canada. Thank you, I don't want to start calling out people, so I don't want anybody to get upset, but thank you, everybody on this call. I appreciate it, and I do hope that this is the beginning of a conversation.
I step out of the